Late in the 8th century, they arrived from the freezing seas of the north to take the world by storm. For the next 300 years, they ravaged the civilized nations. Nothing could stop them. Not the seas, not the dread of the unknown, not the rulers of Europe. The Vikings. Explorers, settlers and traders, Vikings struck out in search of plunder and legitimate wealth. From the shores of North America to the markets of Baghdad, they threw open the borders to social, political and economic change. And then they vanished. "1,200 years ago, the Vikings exploded out of the cold North Sea, like beasts unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. They came from the land of fjords, a land hard to farm, and bitter clan rivalries, modern-day Scandinavia. They left behind legends of their violence and courage, sagas of exploration and conquest, along with treasures buried in their Scandinavian homelands. In 1880, Norwegian archaeologists made an extraordinary discovery, opening a window to the past and revealing for the first time how the Vikings truly lived and died. They found shards of strange tools, jewels and wood carvings.
It was amazing. It transformed Vikings from a marauding culture of the north with supposedly horned helmets and swords descending on Europe into a people who had a civilization as complex and as artistic as any in Europe at the time.
One object, unearthed at a number of burial sites across Scandinavia, revealed more about the Viking Norse people than any other. A grave ship, buried as a tomb and filled with the goods its owner needed for his voyage to the afterlife.
The only way to get from place to place was by boat, and they developed wonderful boats. When they first started excavating, they didn't believe that they actually sailed in these wonderful ships. They were wonderfully seaworthy, very handleable, and could, of course, they only drew about 3 inches or something and could go up rivers.
One of the wonderful things that the Vikings did oftentimes with their great personages was to bury them in their ships with all the implements, because they felt that they were then going, death brought a journey. All the implements that one might need for life into eternity was put on the ship and then buried. And so it's all very well preserved.
Who were these mysterious barbarians with their elaborate burials, and what drove them to dominate the Dark Ages? Their story began in the late 700s in the uplands of Norway.
We do have some indications of what life was like before the Vikings took to the sea and began their raids. They tend to be a sedentary, agriculturally oriented people who were pretty much organized around villages or clans of some sort, probably familiarly oriented, although we're not exactly sure about that. But they tended to have chiefs who ruled these little groups and sometimes had war in between them. But the Viking life was very much one of survival. The climate was colder than would have been in the rest of Europe. The weather could be brutal at times. It was probably difficult to stay alive, and that's an important point to make.
At the dawn of the Viking Age, the family farm was the basic economic unit of Norse life. As farmers and herdsmen, They planted grains and vegetables during the short growing seasons and relied heavily on livestock. But peace in the Northland was coming to an end. The expanding Viking population needed more fertile farmland, and tensions boiled over. Inevitably, violence flared between the Viking clans. As the stronger attacked the weaker, raiders fell on farmers with axes, swords, and brutal violence. Land feuds erupted with utter lawlessness.
Basically, a king was a man who had a big farm. And he had his bonders, his farmers, and his slaves. And whenever he felt like going and attacking somebody else, he just got all his guys together and went off and attacked them. The Vikings would run into the village, grab everything they could, take off again. So it's not terribly sophisticated, but very effective.
Some Vikings, however, set aside their differences and prepared to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The hands and tools that once shaped the cross beams of barns turned to another task. Along the shores of the northern inlets, boats were built. Boats that changed the lives of these people. Viking Longships. These extraordinary vessels, revolutionary in design, took history on a new course and launched an onslaught that dominated Europe and beyond for the next 3 centuries. In the Longship, Vikings drew on generations of boat-building techniques and seafaring skills.
There would have been no Vikings without the Viking ship. And it is that evolution of that technology that allowed them to make such a mark on history. In time, they learned to make boats that were seaworthy enough to travel the North Atlantic. This was really what gave the Vikings their long reach. You could put one of these boats together in maybe a month or 6 weeks. And the design was always exactly the same. And they would make the boat either as broad as they needed for calm waters or as deep as they needed it for open oceans. And if they wanted a boat to go up the rivers of Russia or in Europe, a raiding boat that might go into the heart of the continent, they could make the same style, the same construction technique, but just a small version. They were light enough to be carried over portages, they could be dragged up rivers, and they could be sailed. And that was one of the important features because the boats were swift like lightning and there wasn't anything that could catch them.
It's no longer a coastal vessel like many of the Mediterranean ones were. They would make the jump from Norway to Scotland and from the Faroe Islands to Iceland and from Iceland to Greenland over open waters that were far too dangerous for coastal vessels ever to take on. And the Vikings weren't frightened by this, and they had the technology to make it happen.
The result was a boat with a low draft and high adaptability, a technological marvel for its day. No single king or central government led these people. Each Norse village acted independently. Each declared its own king. The Vikings banded together on this bold mission, leaving women and children behind and taking to the seas. They were after plunder, so they armed themselves accordingly. Among the first victims of their raiding were the monks of Lindisfarne, home to St. Cuthbert's Monastery in June 793. Lindisfarne was one of the holiest places in the British Isles, rich with piety and with more tangible treasures.
These monks their bells are ringing, they're going to Mass, and up out of the sea come these dragons. And the Vikings came on them just like a storm and cut them down, carried off everything, and burned the place.
The monks were met by hell. And they described it often as if the devils from hell are being unleashed on them. The Vikings were warriors, there's no doubt, but they lived by intimidation, fear, and terrorism. They were raiders. They weren't soldiers.
I think they were extremely fierce and extremely greedy and extremely skillful. I mean, we think of these people as being barbarians, but in fact, I think the order of battle, the way in which they moved on a target in a very disciplined military way.
The Viking Warrior was a very simple war machine. It was a big, brawny Scandinavian, often dressed in leather, hide, armor. Each person was equipped with very simple tools: a knife, a sword, and a battle axe.